But today I am very excited to introduce Jeremy Yeaton. So Jeremy did his bachelor's in linguistics and French at Rutgers University before doing a master's degree in cognitive science at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where he did lots of interesting research on functional neuroimaging in humans as well as in non-human primates. Before starting his PhD in language sciences at the University of California, Irvine, which is my alma mater, but technically a different department, working with Gregory Hickok at UCI, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. And they've been doing a lot of interesting work the last several years on syntax and neurobiology of language. So I'm pleased to introduce Jeremy talking about attempting to quantify expressive syntactic competence. So please welcome Jeremy, and Jeremy, go ahead and take it away.
Cool. Hi, thank you for that very, very nice introduction. I just want to preface this by emphasizing the fact that the first word of my title is attempting. So all of this is rather preliminary in a lot of ways. I don't think any of the results that I'm presenting today have been published yet, but they're in preparation, so keep your eyes peeled. So I just want to start with a quick definition of syntax. So for the purposes of this talk, we can argue about the semantics of syntax at a different point. Purposes of this talk, syntax is the abstract hierarchical relationships between words, and I put words in quotes, in language based on their structural properties rather than their semantic or phonological ones. The reason I put words in quotes is because words aren't real. I'm not going to get into the argument of why words aren't real. There are people who are much more qualified to do that. Here, I can direct you toward their work. But I'm going to be using words as a convenient shorthand throughout this talk of, the atomic atoms of language. So one of the problems that we face, those of us working on production, is a sort of comprehension centrism in the neurobiology of language as a whole, which is that most syntax investigations use comprehension. But the problem is that comprehension is confounded with working memory demands. So disrupting phonological working memory impacts complex sentence comprehension. So it seems like comprehension maybe isn't our best bet. But on the other hand, production isn't studied very much, and it's quite hard to quantify. So if, on the one hand, production and comprehension use the same mechanisms and the same, underlying neural substrate, we don't have to worry about it. We can just use comprehension and just kind of refine our comprehension testing strategies. But in a ALE meta-analysis, Walensky and colleagues found that they had overlapping regions implicated in production and comprehension, but not exactly the same system. And if you'll note, they had 45 studies for comprehension and only 15 for production. So already we see that there's kind of a power imbalance here. Giglio and colleagues found that you had the same regions, kind of these broad swaths of cortex that were implicated in both production and comprehension, but different levels of activation depending on input versus output. So it seems like maybe not exactly the same thing is happening at the syntactic level in both production and comprehension. So the question is then, what's going on in production? So when I say production, I'm talking about sentence generation. And so you have some concept or message. Here we have a delightful feline taking a stroll. And then you want to articulate that into sounds in the world. So we have the cat is walking. And then somewhere in between there, we have this mysterious black box of syntax. And so throughout the last 30 years or so, a number of theoretical accounts have been put forward about what is happening as you produce a sentence, what is going on in grammatical encoding. And these four hand-selected figures from the theoretical models of sentence production seem to converge on two streams. So you have functional versus positional processing. I forget what this side is officially called. Oh, content processing versus structure processing. It's right there. Linear versus hierarchical, and representation versus linearization. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on representation versus linearization. But in principle, these are all more or less the same things. So in the representation side, we have lemma or treelet processing, we have function assignment, hierarchical operations, and lexical selection. Versus on the linearization side, you have constituent assembly, inflectional morphosyntax, and linear ordering. So then if we have this sort of theoretical distinction between these two processes, perhaps we also have a neural one. So I'm going to steal William and Greg's figure here, where we're seeing this linear morphosyntactic versus hierarchical operation. And so our linearization side is happening in the inferior frontal lobe, and our hierarchical or representation side is happening in the temporal lobe. But since this is a C-star talk, of course, we have to talk about aphasia. And so we're talking about syntax in aphasia, we have sort of the classical approach, which is you have Wernicke's aphasia on the one hand, which is fluent, but with frequent errors. And then, you also have impaired sentence comprehension. On the other hand, you have Broca's aphasia, which is non-fluent and has spared sentence comprehension. But this lumps together expressive and receptive deficits, which it seems like maybe is too strong of an assumption. It's also based on constrained tasks or testing batteries, which maybe don't super mimic the natural production of language. And then we see that these syndromes often do not match up with the clinical data. So people don't really fit neatly into these buckets in this way. If we're looking at specific syntactic deficits, we have agrammatism and paragrammatism, which I'll get to in a little bit more in a moment. And these are assessed by clinical perceptions. But there's a lack of alignment of definitions, especially in paragrammatism. And there's also no operationalization of the severity of syntactic deficits. So someone either is or is not agrammatic, is or is not paragrammatic, with no way to say this person is very paragrammatic or not very paragrammatic, for example. So if we look at our expressive syntactic disorders, on the one hand, we have paragrammatism, and on the other, agrammatism. So paragrammatism involves the overuse of grammatical morphemes, producing sentence monsters, as Karl Kleist called them. So you might end up with something like, and he sends to everybody to tell people you're everybody around. Or, I know why she had really feet, but everyone else who knows why. So it seems like it could be pretty fluent. They have pretty much all of the necessary parts of speech in there, but something has gone awry in the hierarchical structure of the sentence. On the other hand, we have agrammatism, which is missing functional morphemes and has little to no syntactic structure, and has been therefore characterized as being telegraphic speech. So for example, and big and small and Cinderella perfect. So you can kind of get a sense for what this person is trying to say, but the connective tissue of the sentence is gone. And so I'm going to argue that paragrammatism is predominantly a breakdown in sort of the representation side of our psycholinguistic models of sentence production, whereas agrammatism is a breakdown in the linearization side of the processing. So historically, the way these conditions have been assessed is through perceptual classification. So William and colleagues in 2020 released a paper where they watched the videos of 53 people with aphasia retelling the story of Cinderella, and they found that if they classified them as being agrammatic, paragrammatic, both or neither, those who were agrammatic consistently had this sort of frontal, inferior frontal lesion. And then Casilio and colleagues, using a system that they described in 2019 and then reproduced in 2024, found that the people that they perceptually classified as being agrammatic had a somewhat similar lesion, but a little bit more posterior, but high agreement between raters. On the paragrammatic side, it seems like, or rather, the people that the Machin paper classified as being paragrammatic had this posterior, mid to posterior temporal lesion. And And then Casilio and all weren't classifying people as being paragrammatic per se. They had kind of a broader group of features that they were looking at, one of which was paragrammatism. And they found that, yes, this group of features centralized to the temporal lobe. So it seems like, okay, yes, these different conditions are perceptually retrievable in some sense, but there's still a fair amount of noise in this process. So what seems like the next step to me is to try to quantify the output. Zainab Kushal Malasare, who is a PhD student with William, has been working on this, trying to see whether in patients that have been classified as agrammatic, there are any lesion correlates to the various measures of the typical quantitative production analysis QPA approach. And so if we look at the lesion maps for all of these different measures, so you have mean length of utterance, proportion of nouns and verbs, percent of adverbs, percent past tense, etc., there's not a lot going on that really shows us a lot of promise. We have, okay, percent of past tense seems to look like this agrammatism lesion. Verbs per utterance seems to also overlap there. And then if we look at the paragrammatism lesion, we see this closed versus open metric that seems to show up in the posterior temporal lobe. And then percent nouns, percent nouns also shows some posterior temporal implication. But again, there's not a lot of really strong, obvious, like, okay, this one metric localizes to this one location, therefore that's what's going on. So a quick recap here, we have Cinderella running down the stairs at midnight to emphasize the urgency of the situation. Lumping together comprehension and production into syndromes doesn't seem to hold up well to clinical data. Human raters are reliable at perceptual classification of agrammatism, but a little bit more hit or miss in paragrammatism. We don't have a good non-judgment based measure. So we saw that the QPA approach has a little bit of noise. There's not like a clear solution there. And other than that, it's just, is this person agrammatic or paragrammatic? And then finally, we have no means of quantifying the deficit severity. So what I'm suggesting is a different way. William, Danielle Fahey, Brielle Stark, and I are working on a mechanism for characterizing both the kind and severity of an expressive syntactic deficit. And then this would allow for expressive and receptive deficits to be considered separately and provides a better descriptive framework for the structure of aphasic production. And so we have called this the syntactic utterance-based analysis, or SUBA, which we found to be a more friendly acronym relative to the alternative, which was utterance level syntactic analysis, or ULSA, which just didn't really sound very nice. So we picked the cooler acronym. And so this system is designed to capture breakdowns in representation versus linearization, processing, and discourse. And so what we'll do is we take a transcript of someone retelling the story of Cinderella, and then we go utterance by utterance, line by line, and we characterize the types of errors that are observed in a given utterance. And so those are classified into the following options. You can have a grammatical utterance, which is well-formed and contains no errors, for example, and they were all trying on the shoes to see which of them could get into the shoes, where it seems like this person might be having a little bit of trouble with pronouns, but the sentence itself is grammatical nonetheless. You can have representation level errors, which are things like subcategorization or unfilled nodes and branches. So she was thinking about the things that she was for everything she was goings something. So something there is gone wrong. And it seems like it's at this representation level. It's at the hierarchical organization rather than at the morphosyntactic level. We can have linearization errors, which is the omission of multiple functional morphemes. So, and he meet prints at party, or you have a couple of, functional elements that are going wrong. mixed errors, which are a combination of one or more missing functional morphemes plus a representation processing error. So these are a combination of features from both of these levels of processing. And so we have something like, anyway, it's right at midnight. She realized she's supposed to go back at midnight back. So we have the omission of the past tense marker on realize, as well as this sort of strange reduplication of the preposition. We can have omission of a single functional morpheme, and the reason we coded this as separate from the linearization deficit is that omission of a single functional morpheme can arise as a result of either a representation or a linearization level breakdown. So it could be that you've selected the wrong syntactic features and therefore you're not producing it correctly, or it could be that you produce the right syntactic features, so that would be the representation side. And then on the linearization side, it could be that you generated the right syntactic features, but when you tried to put it into the morphosyntax to linearize it, you lost something. And so we coded these separately because it could be either one. And so something like, and the first guy wasn't going them, where you just have this dropped preposition. We can also have semantically anomalous, but syntactically well-formed sentences if someone selects the wrong word, if they're saying, the witch versus the stepmother. And then neologistic or phonological errors, but syntactically well-formed. So if someone just mispronounces something, we want to encode that somehow, but we don't, it's not a syntactic error. So if we're looking specifically for syntactic errors, that doesn't really qualify. So in terms of participants, we had 88 people with aphasia that were recruited at the University of South Carolina. Thanks, C-Star. We appreciate your data. Each of them had a discourse sample retelling the story of Cinderella, and 53 of these were the same ones that participated in the Match et al. 2020 study. But then we added an additional 35 people with aphasia. See if we can get it a little beefier here. We also coded 53 age-matched healthy controls. These are age-matched to the original match-in sample, and those are drawn from the aphasia bank. So if we look at the error distribution over the full group, and this is kind of what we're trying to do, rather than look at it in any one dimension, we can look at the error distribution and see how people are making errors rather than just trying to clump them into one bucket or another. So this is for the control group. In this top panel, we have the proportion of utterances. And so we see that they're producing the vast majority grammatical utterances. Good job, healthy people. And then we have, relatively small amounts of these other utterance types. But if we throw out all the grammatical utterances and we look just at the types of errors that they're making, we see that they're producing predominantly representation level errors, as well as some semantic and omission errors. But critically, they're producing no linearization errors. They're out of the question for the healthy people. If we look at our people with aphasia, we see that, again, that most of them are grammatical utterances, so good for them. And then if we look at our distribution over error types, predominantly representation errors, but some mixed, some linearization, and then some phonological stuff going on. And so it seems like, okay, on the whole, we do see a difference in distribution between our healthy controls and our people with aphasia, promising that we're capturing something actually going on. But critically, people don't all have the same distribution over error types. So it is not that every single person with aphasia looks like this. They don't all have exactly this amount of each of the different types of errors. So I'm not going to go in through all the frames of this particular figure. I just picked some random participants. But we see that this one in particular is producing grammatical errors, but then also some mixed and omission errors, or grammatical utterances rather, not grammatical errors. This one is producing mostly grammatical, but then all of the errors that they're making are at the representation level. This one is producing basically only linearization errors and produced almost no grammatical utterances. So this person has a very severe linearization deficit. And then this one is doing a pretty good job, but producing a lot of phonological errors. So pretty good at syntax, not so good at phonology. And so we see that each of these individuals can sort of be characterized as a distribution over the different lesion or different error types. So then our next question was, do these different error codes capture anything real at a neural level? So we have pretty good lesion coverage across the left hemisphere, and we used a mass univariate voxel-wise lesion symptom mapping approach. And so we used proportion of each error type as our predictor. So the question is then, does damage to a given voxel predict an increase in that error type? So if we look at our error codes, the proportion of representation level errors resulted in a lesion that's sort of in two pieces. You have this mid to posterior temporal STS lesion, and then also this kind of cluster of voxels in the parietal lobe. Linearization maps onto this frontal lesion, which promising because we decided that linearization and agrammatism were sort of related to each other. Mixed errors have kind of this broad distribution across the temporal lobe. And then omission errors had kind of a random smattering, but it's more of a feature than a bug in that omission errors can arise as a result of either linearization or representation level errors. And so the fact that we see this broad distribution means that, okay, yes, we're capturing this, but we're capturing them from both people with linearization and representation level breakdowns. So it just kind of doesn't really know where to put it. So while that is great that we can see these, each of these error types has a lesion correlate, one of the things that we set out to do in the beginning was not focus on this sort of univariate, this is the only variable that matters approach to looking at syntax. So rather than stopping here, we used a clustering approach. And so we passed all of our scores, all of the proportions of the different error types to a k-means classifier, which is just an unsupervised clustering of participants based on their error distributions. And so we had used a partitioning around medoids algorithm with a max k of 12. And then the algorithm decided for us that if we cap it at 12, the best number of clusters is 10. So based on sort of some feature selection kind of stuff, it decided 10 was the best number. And then we're interpreting these as sort of phenotypes of expressive syntactic deficit. So this is the membership of each of our clusters. The ordering put out by the algorithm is arbitrary, so I picked the order. But we see that the yellow or the colored bars are people with aphasia and the gray bars are healthy controls. And so we have these 4 groups down here that are mixed between healthy controls and people with aphasia, which is interesting for 2 reasons. One is that there are people with aphasia that pattern in the same way as healthy controls. So if we're only looking at the syntax level, there are people with, stroke damage who are still producing syntax errors at the same rate as healthy controls. On the other hand, we see that healthy controls distribute differently than each other. So it is not that healthy controls have a monolithic distribution over error types. People have different phenotypes for the types of errors that they produce as they age. So, okay, interesting. And then these are the error distribution over all of the clusters. These 4 are our healthy controls. We see that, okay, yes, we have different weights for each of them. We don't really care that much. These are the fun ones. These are the clusters that seem to have distinct syntactic deficits. So then our next question was, is there a neural correlate of the clusters? So does damage to a given voxel predict membership in some cluster? So if we look at cluster number 1 is primarily characterized by representation level errors. So lots of representation level errors at the utterance level. Most of their errors are representation, but they also, relative to the other groups, produced a lot of utterances, and also made a lot of syntactic error, or semantic errors rather. So we're capturing some other stuff in here beyond just the fact that they're making a lot of representation errors. And so we see that membership in this cluster localizes to this posterior temporal inferior parietal lesion, that if we compare it to just the representation level errors, we see that there's some similarity here, which is, good. We're capturing something. But there's a broader distribution. So it seems like maybe we're capturing something in this sort of phenotyping approach that we're not capturing in the look at it only as a single variable approach. If we look at cluster 2, which is predominantly linearization errors, see this very large frontal and parietal lesion, which matches up well with our linearization lesion. So great. Seems like this is a sane thing that's happening here. If we look at our mixed errors, we see that people producing mixed errors also produce lots of omissions and representation errors, which is basically the definition of the mixed errors in the first place. You're making representation level errors and omission errors in the same sentence. And so membership in this cluster is localized to this very large temporal lesion, as is our proportion of mixed errors. So seems like this is a promising approach if we're capturing something more by clustering them in this way than just focusing on any given single error type. So if we kind of put these all next to each other, or the representation level ones and the linearization lesions, and then compare that to the Machen et al. Lesion map for agrammatism and paragrammatism, it seems like we do get some amount of alignment here. So yes, on the one hand, we can do our perceptual classification as being agrammatic or paragrammatic, which is kind of loosely based on these notions of representation versus linearization. But if we can use this utterance level approach, we can get something that is a little bit more fine-grained, but which produces a qualitatively similar lesion map. So another quick recap, we see that a binary classification is insufficient to capture the variance across participants. More phenotypes are happening than just agrammatic versus paragrammatic. Participants can be described in terms of a distribution over these psycholinguistically informed error types. And then our subcoding system combined with clustering produces neurally meaningful phenotypes. So if we're looking at the next steps for this project, we want to apply this methodology cross-linguistically. So we're currently working on French and Spanish and looking for collaborators of other languages. This image here, I asked Microsoft Designer to generate an image of Cinderella holding some flags to, and this is what we got. So enjoy. We're also interested in investigating the comorbidity of phonological and semantic deficits with syntactic ones. And as sort of a side note, different direction, it seems like preposition selection produces a persistent challenge for people with paragrammatic style output. So if anyone's really stoked on prepositions, please reach out. I would be very happy to discuss kind of how we can approach this as a team project. So our next question is, do production and comprehension interact? If we've been able to say, okay, let's just look at production, here's what we get, but maybe these are related. And so one of the approaches to this has been the overarching agrammatism hypothesis, which is that agrammatic comprehension entails a production deficit and vice versa. And so William Machen and colleagues last year released a paper where they found that damage to the agrammatism, the frontal agrammatism ROI, produced expressive agrammatism, but did not result in an apparent syntactic deficit, or a comprehension deficit rather. However, damage to the posterior ROI which resulted in paragrammatic output, seems like it might impact comprehension. So the participants that were agrammatic, that showed a deficit in comprehension, had posterior temporal damage. So if we return to this figure, our question is now, does damage to the hierarchical or representation zone impact parsing or comprehension? So one of the ways that we can look at this is through acceptability judgments. If we're looking at, receptive syntax, how does, are people aware when they're hearing an ungrammatical sentence? And so I actually don't know how to pronounce this name, Linebarger, in 1983, found that people with agrammatic production still showed preserved grammaticality judgments. And then in a recent paper by Danielle Fahey and colleagues, they showed that if you ask participants with aphasia to make grammaticality judgments across a variety of syntactic categories, that lesion corresponded to this posterior temporal zone, without really much implication of the inferior frontal lobe. So it seems like syntactic acceptability judgments are more related to the posterior temporal lobe than the inferior frontal lobe. So if we're looking at receptive syntax across a little bit more data, we have data from the SOAP, which is the subject relative, object relative, active, and passive, and plausibility judgments from Rogalski et al. 2018, and this nice little mid to posterior STS lesion, very exciting. If we look at sentence comprehension from the WAB and the NABs in the C-star data set, we see this, mid to posterior STS lesion, as well as some frontal involvement. But as we've discussed, comprehension can implicate frontal regions as well for different reasons. And then if we collapse across the conditions from the Fahey et al. Acceptability judgment study, again, we see this mid to posterior temporal lesion. So it seems like we have this hotspot for syntactic receptive syntax. And then at a behavioral level, we don't see a robust relationship between agrammatic or paragrammatic output and comprehension performance. So if we look at the proportion of each of these different error types that they're producing, we don't see a significant impact, at least statistically significant impact on comprehension. So we're going to zoom in on here on our posterior temporal hotspot. If we look at the maximum overlap of receptive syntax measures, those from the previous slide, as well as the proportion of representation errors, it seems like these are nestled right next to each other in the posterior temporal lobe, the posterior STS. But then the real question is this a dissociation? So the big asterisk on all of this data is that we're working with kind of a messy Venn diagram of data sets. I don't have all of these different data points for any of the participants in my data set. So we're all kind of like, we're piecing this together with different participants, different measures, trying to say, okay, here's the localization of, representation level production and comprehension. And so when I presented this at SNL last year, Stephen Wilson came over to my poster and gave me a stern talking to about over-interpreting these results. So how do we get a clear dissociation? If a clear dissociation is possible, how can we approach this? And so for that, I have some tentative paths forward to suggest. The first one is the creation of my PhD advisor, Greg Hickok, which is the animated aphasia test. And so it uses items from the Severity Calibrated Aphasia Naming Test, or SCANT. And so the goal is to have controlled difficulty matched items for the input and output modalities. And so it's designed to assess object naming, action naming, canonical and non-canonical phrase and morphosyntax elicitation, word and sentence repetition, and word and sentence comprehension. So a lot of stuff happening all at the same time. How could we possibly do this? Let's show you. So we have these nifty little animations of some actions happening. And so first, participants are asked to name, repeat, and point to each item. The pointing is, say, can you point to the banana? In that version of it, at this stage of the task, it's not moving, but I didn't want to have too many different pictures. So you're pointing to each item, and then you're asked to name and repeat the verb. Here's this eating or biting. And then asked to elicit a complete sentence in the active voice. What did the queen do? The queen bit the banana. In the passive, what happened to the banana? Produce it in a full sentence. The banana was eaten by the queen. And then a couple of comprehension questions. Was the queen eaten by the banana? So are you able to correctly interpret this syntactic structure? And so for results, I put results in scare quotes because this is very preliminary data. I actually don't have the repetition or comprehension data available to me yet, but I'm excited to see it because I think it'll be fun. And we see that participants disproportionately struggle with the elicitation and repetition of the passive relative to the active. So we have this example here of a participant saying, the lion is licking the bone in the active, perfectly well formed, but in the passive, when trying to form the passive, they ended up with the bone is licking by the lion. So you can see that they have some sort of knowledge of what a passive is supposed to look like, but then when they try to produce it, they just can't really bring it together. And so with additional data, we can look for dissociations between elicitation, repetition, and comprehension performance, and then ask, are there distinct lesion correlates to performance on the different phases of the task? Now, we have a different but very similar task here, which is that my advisor and I had the same question and then separately devised very similar tasks to ask it. So this one is mine. I have dubbed it the non-sentence repetition task. And so what the principle is that it's a difficulty matched items to look at expressive and receptive syntactic ability. And the main idea of this task is that it relies on the sentence superiority effect. So the sentence superiority effect is a version of syntactic compression, wherein sentences are more accurately recalled when they form a grammatical sequence. So participants are presented with grammatical and ungrammatical sentences. Those ungrammatical sentences can be ungrammatical in one of three ways. You can have determiner noun number mismatch. So 1 hot coffees was poured by the man. A subject verb number mismatch. 1 student are stealing an apple. Or a tense mismatch. 2 cats were chased by the young woman. So then what does a trial look like? Participants are presented with the sentence. They render an acceptability judgment. Is this grammatical or ungrammatical? They're then asked to do a verbatim repetition of the item. And so whether or not it contains an error, produce it back as it was presented to you. And then if they deem the sentence to be unacceptable, the sentence presented again, and then they're asked to provide a corrected repetition. What is the minimal change you can make to make this version of the sentence into a grammatical one? And so the scoring has been done by my intrepid research assistants. And so the output measures from this study are a grammaticality discrimination score. How accurate are you at discriminating grammatical from ungrammatical sentences? We can look at judgment response time. And then if we're looking at their repetitions and corrections, we can annotate those in 2 ways. We have strict accuracy, which is modulo, mispronunciations and mistypings. Did you get exactly what was in the input? And then we have loose accuracy, which is if we give you a little bit of leeway, if you have the right answer, modulo 1 morpheme inserted, deleted, or substituted, we can give you credit for that. And then all of the items are annotated for grammaticality. And then in terms of online production measures, we can look at production onset time and production rate. And so the reason I said production and not speech is because this is being done in both typing and speech. So far, we only have 23 healthy undergraduates. I do not have aphasia data yet for this one, hopefully soon. And so the data that I'm about to present to you is auditory presentation and typed production. So the speech data takes a little bit longer to analyze, so we're still working on it. But if we look at their judgment, acceptability judgments, they're very good at it. Unsurprisingly, healthy undergraduates can discriminate between grammatical and ungrammatical sentences. They're a little bit less accurate at the subject-verb mismatch condition than the other ones, but I didn't have any a priori hypotheses about how the different conditions would differ. I just wanted to have different error types, and so we'll see differences between these conditions, which I think is interesting, but I don't really have at the moment a theoretical interpretation for that. So then if we look at the results of the verbatim repetition, even if it contains an error, repeat it back exactly as it was presented to you. Unsurprisingly, people are much more accurate at producing the grammatical sentences than the ungrammatical ones. And so this is with the strict accuracy. Can you do it precisely as it was presented? And then if we look at it across conditions, we see that people are particularly bad at the tense mismatch condition, especially under the strict coding. So if we give them a little bit more leeway, we can see that they improve quite a bit, especially in the ungrammatical condition. So this is under our loose coding. And again, we see that especially this tense mismatch condition is brought up quite a bit. So a question I got at a previous time that I presented these results was, okay, well, if you're giving them loose accuracy, could that be them just producing a grammatical sentence? And so I went back and looked at my data, and that does happen, but it is not the only thing that happens. So if we look at the corrected repetitions, so you said the sentence is ungrammatical, you're now given the opportunity to produce a grammatical version of it. So in the strict coding, participants are pretty good at it, except in the tense mismatch condition. But then if you give them that little bit of leeway, accuracy goes way up. And so the persistent problems that we saw that allowed for people to be loosely accurate is saw people omit adjectives, and a lot of people change the tense. So a lot of past to present, present to past. But if the only thing that you're producing differently is a tense feature, you did a pretty good job. And then we also have some online measures, and these online measures are masterminded by Shiva Upadhyay, who's another grad student in my department. And so she has done some work on typing and typing production, and so was interested to see whether, okay, do we see a longer onset time? Is there a longer planning period for grammatical versus ungrammatical versus grammatical sentences? And we do see that it takes people longer to start typing in the ungrammatical condition. They also have a lower typing rate in the ungrammatical condition. So the time in between key presses is slightly longer in the ungrammatical condition. And then if we're looking at monitoring and editing, we can just look at how often people use the backspace key. It's an easy way to say, okay, how aware are you of the errors you're making, and are you able to correct them? And so the advantage of doing this in typing is that errors in typing are cheap relative to speech. And so people are very willing to mistype and then hit backspace versus people are going to be trying to be a little bit more accurate when they're speaking. And so we do see fewer errors being monitored and repaired in the determiner noun mismatch condition versus the other two. And that's in the verbatim phase. In the correction phase, we see something similar. So something about this determiner noun condition allows people to be a little bit more sure, a little bit more confident, more accurate in their productions. So if we're looking at future directions for this task, obviously we would like to adapt and apply it in people with aphasia, the thought being we can use length adapted phrases and sentences. So we figure out what someone's sentence repetition span is, and we give them sentences around that length. That way it's not super mega hard if the sentences are too long and not too easy if the sentences are too short. And then we're hopefully looking for dissociations between performance on the different phases of the task. And then a sort of methodological question that we can use this task for is, can typing help skirt around motor speech issues in aphasia? So we know that okay, yes, a lot of people with aphasia also have some amount of motor issues in the hands, or yeah. And so typing might be a problem, but on the other hand, it might be easier. There's not a lot of work on this, so this could be an interesting direction to go. And then I had a conversation at some point last year with Lena Pilkinen, who asked me, what is the low-hanging fruit on this project? And so that forced me to kind of rethink what I was doing. And I determined that one of the things we can do is sort of a methodological question, which is, can we leverage the input and output modalities, so listen and reading versus speaking and typing, to advance our understanding of supramodal grammatical encoding? So does input or output modality impact performance? Does a mismatch between the input and output modalities impact performance? So if you're getting auditory input and you're asked to type it, or you're getting visual input and asked to speak it, does that mismatch between the input and output modalities make you less accurate? And then, do we see the same types of errors and or slowdowns regardless of output modality? So do people slow down or make mistakes at the same parts of the sentence in the same conditions if you're asking them to speak versus type? So one more quick recap. We have two novel tasks to capture different levels of syntactic processing. They're targeting both receptive and expressive competence, and they have the potential to show dissociations between performance at the different phases of the task, if such a thing is possible. And therefore, we have some cautious optimism. So here's my soapbox speculation about an expressive and receptive dissociation. So if we see our schematic here of the language of the syntactic system versus our representation level errors map, in theory, it should be possible to dissociate between representation level errors and output. So if we see people that are making lots of representation errors, they should still be people that are able to comprehend sentences well. And that would be because of different underlying causes for paragrammatic output. And so on the one hand, you would have quote unquote overarching paragrammatism, which would be a paragrammatic output and a comprehension deficit. And so that would be a breakdown in the hierarchical level of the model and in this mid to posterior temporal ROI. On the other hand, we could have syntactic conduction aphasia, which would result in paragrammatic production, but retained or spared comprehension. And so that would be more so a breakdown in the sensory motor transform between the hierarchical system and the linear system. And so maybe that's what's going on over here in this parietal lesion, is some sort of sensory motor transform that is breaking down the connections between the linearization and representation systems. So just to wrap up quickly, quantifying syntactic competence or impairment remains challenging. This is especially true in the production domain. The relationship between production and parsing remains unclear under the available tasks and data, but high-dimensional multi-stage tasks, which test multiple skills with the same items, can help close this gap by producing much deeper data that allows us to sort of make these apples-to-apples comparisons in the same participants. So with that, thank you for your attention. Thank you to all of my various team members and advisors and RAs. And then one additional point is that I am on the job market. So if you would like to hire me, you can scan that QR code. It takes you to my website. You can learn all about me. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm going to turn your camera around so that you can see the in-person audience here. Hopefully that's visible. And thank you very much for the talk. So let's take questions from the in-person audience first, and then we'll proceed to questions from online. So any questions for Jeremy? There's a question by Sarah in the back.
So great talk. I actually have a question about your non-sentence, your new non-sentence task. So we study healthy adults in our aging brain cohort, and we have a task where people repeat non-words. So they're just made up words. And what we found is that individuals that have some hearing loss actually tend to do very poorly on this task, not because they can't hear the stimuli, but because they kind of fill in the gaps. And they will say real words out loud that are close to the non-word. So for example, like if someone said flint, they might say flint, and they fill in the gaps for what would make sense. So my question for you is, I know your initial data is with undergraduates, but can you speculate what you think might be happening differently in healthy controls versus patients with aphasia in terms of when they hear that stimuli, do they recognize the error, first of all? Do they have a desire to correct it? And then are they able to produce it? Because I think even in that test, there's 3 different kind of levels of processing.
So yeah, so your exact question was the goal of the task, which is, can we see people who are able to recognize syntactic errors, but yet unable to correct them? Or do we see people who do not recognize syntactic errors, and so if they hear an error, just in one ear out the other, and then if you're asking them to produce an ungrammatical sentence, do they just produce a grammatical one every time? And so if we can see which participants are recognizing the syntactic errors, and then see if those are the same ones that are having a really hard time reproducing the ungrammatical ones, it might be that this is sort of some unconscious process where you're just like, okay, somewhere in this mapping process, it didn't register that it was ungrammatical, but when you try to produce it, it comes out as a grammatical version. There was a case like this in the 70s, I think, or maybe it was the 50s. I don't remember, where if you said an ungrammatical sentence, this person had very severe echolalia, and so they would produce it back grammatical. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you think it would be different between the healthy controls and the patients
Oh,
in terms of that error recognition. Like, we know a lot of the patients with aphasia may produce those errors, but do they also recognize those errors, or do you think that would also be different?
I think it'll depend on the individual. I think there are people who will recognize them, and I think there are people who won't. We know that this is also true, especially in people recognizing their own errors. And so in a lot of cases, people, especially people with more paragrammatic output, are not aware of the errors that they're making. And so one of the suggestions for this task was just to elicit sentences and then have them do grammaticality judgments on their own sentences. But we decided that would be a little bit complicated to try to operationalize. So yeah, so I think that we will see participants in the aphasia group who are able to do these dissociations, who are able to discriminate between grammatical and ungrammatical sentences. But I also expect and hope, in some sense, to see some who are not able to do so. But I would hope that the healthy participants should be pretty good at it.
Are there other questions? Yeah, say now.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you so much for the talk. I have 2 questions. First is about your task. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I understood that the stimulus that you are presenting to the aphasia subject is matched based on their memory span, right? So what if that stimulus that you're using is not challenging them? So did you think about this issue?
So like if the stimulus that I'm giving them is too easy?
Yeah, exactly. So you are considering that the stimulus is like based on their memory span, but it could be an easier structure for them. Based, like for example, if it says 3 or 4 words, so it can't be a difficult structure.
And the sentences that we're using we're not planning to make them be very difficult. And so it's mostly just like, okay, if we give you a grammatical sentence, those should be the easiest ones to remember and therefore repeat. What is sort of the maximum length you can do for a grammatical sentence? And then we'll just give you grammatical and ungrammatical sentences around that length. I don't want to use super mega complicated sentences because I don't want this to be like just a working memory task. I would like to see, okay, what role does working memory play in this? But I'm not interested in working memory per se so much as the syntactic input and output stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so the other question is about the structure that you are considering to create your stimulus. So I think it's just more morphology, right? It's just, you know, the subject verb. So did you consider to like think of the syntactic structures? Like what?
So yes, this was floated. And I'm very open to suggestions on this front. The issue is that it's hard to produce sentences with hierarchical breakdowns in syntactic structure that do not just rely on being a word scramble. So how do we produce a tree that is degraded in some way and yet doesn't involve some sort of chaotic word order situation? Because in the Fahey et al. Acceptability judgment task, they found that the word order violations were trivially easy to identify, even for people with aphasia. And so I wanted to find things that were a little bit more subtle, I guess. But yeah, I did end up with things that were just morphosyntax. So if people have suggestions for how we could rethink the stimuli in such a way that we would produce sentences with hierarchical syntax degradation, but not just be like a little bit word salady, happy to hear your suggestions.
Thank you.
We have a question from the online audience. This is Tatiana Schnur. I'm just going to read it out loud. Regarding the comparison of lesion symptom maps to provide evidence of dissociation between SUBA error types, I think there was a previous, Tatiana has two questions. So the first one was interesting. Why is the SUBA approach significantly better than QPA, right? What's the motivation to create SUBA and why does it address specific weaknesses in previous approaches there?
So instead of looking at just like counting the different types of words that someone is producing and looking at these proportions, it's a little bit more abstract in that we're looking at the breakdowns in the syntactic structure. So we're trying to look at it from this sort of abstract tree level rather than just counting tokens. So yeah, so it originally started as just counting the number of, rather than looking at, you know, the number of nouns and verbs and stuff, just looking at the number of agrammatic versus paragrammatic errors that were being made. And then we've gradually sort of added some granularity to it. But like we saw in the data that I presented from Zainab, the QPA analysis, at least at the neural level, doesn't seem to produce much meaningful. And so any one of those metrics, and perhaps if you combine them in some way, you would get something a little bit more meaningful. But we're getting meaningful maps from the SUBA approach that didn't seem to pan out from the QPA approach. And then regarding your next question, yes, it's on my to-do list to use, because I think you have a software package that I saw you present at SNL, perhaps in Philadelphia, that is designed to compare between different lesion types. So it's on my to-do list to learn how to do that. Yes.
Dirk, do you think, or do we? It's 12:30. It's 12:30, but.
Oh, we can go.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I wanted to add, that's what you said, Jeremy. I mean, so part of, I think, the logic of your approach is that you're looking at it's not just defined as certain kinds of surface level errors, but rather some kind of underlying mechanism which could generate a variety of different surface level errors, right? So rather than saying, we're going to start by just saying how many of a certain kind of surface error there are, it's how many of a certain kind of mechanism which would produce a variety of different manifestations, right? So trying to still go, like, the perceptual approaches that people use, like we did and Stephen Wilson's group has used, Casilio et al., right? They're perceptually trying to identify a certain underlying feature of what's going on rather than just counting the sort of surface level statistics, right? So I think that's a big difference in the approach is surface statistics versus underlying mechanisms that could be reflected in a variety of ways.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's very accurate, is like, rather than counting how many errors we're making, it's how often do errors that are due to a given breakdown in the underlying mechanism appear?
So there's a question by, I believe this is from Yeaton Adam. Within representation or linearization errors, do you expect there to be further subdivisions by functional deficits, for example, by particular syntactic or morphosyntactic structures, passive versus object extracted structures, plural versus verb inflections in English? Such divisions have been proposed in the past, mostly based on explicit laboratory tests. Do you think those are real previous results?
I think they could be, but we are constrained by what people are producing when they're retelling the story of Cinderella, at least for the moment. And people tend to avoid these very complex structures when they're doing so. So at the moment, we don't really have enough data within this context to be able to speak to that. But at a theoretical level, I think, yes, there are structures that should be more challenging than others. So hold on. So your functional deficits, for example, in particular syntactic or morphosyntactic structures. Yeah, so I think like passives in particular, anything that's in a non-canonical word order should be especially challenging for both groups, but for different reasons. And so the linearization group should rely more on canonical word order to produce a sequence, whereas the representation group should have a difficulty making the tree that would produce a syntactic a passive sentence, and therefore the output should be degraded in some way, but in a different way than the linearization group. So I don't have any strong predictions exactly about what that would look like, because I don't have the data to make that claim one way or the other. But yes, I would predict that those divisions are real. And I have some thoughts about what structures should elicit them, but we just aren't seeing those in the data at the moment.
Danielle.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there was a question by Danielle Fahey, and I think it was asking for clarification about pronouns. Like, what are your thoughts? Can you expand more on what might be happening? Why are the pronouns relevant?
Oh, prepositions.
I'm sorry.
She added an asterisk.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I don't honestly have any really strong feelings about why that might be. Prepositions are kind of like a weird category somewhere between function and content words. And so it might be that some of these, did I freeze there for a second? Okay, so I think that perhaps some of the prepositions are challenging because they are in this very functional, wearing a very functional hat, whereas others are wearing a more lexical hat, but are still being used in a very functional way. And so it's kind of a weird syntactic category, but I haven't stared at the data long enough to see if there's any particular patterns that are emerging.
Another question by Dirk Van Ouden, mysterious visitor to the room. For the hierarchical structure ungrammaticalities to test, how about violations of the classic island constraints? E.g., his homework when he had finished, he took a short rest. Like island violations.
That's not a bad idea. Is it possible to do island violations in 4 to 5 word sentences?
There are some. There's like the coordinate structure constraints, you know, who did you see, Mary and?
Okay.
I mean, you might be able to get it down to 5. Or
Yeah, that's a
there's
good idea. Thanks, Dirk.
Yeah. So if I may allow myself a last question, I was actually really interested in the behavioral data from the non-aphasic, non-stroke population, the SUBA coding. You notice that there were different phenotypes for different healthy subjects, which is interesting in and of itself. Like, I've got a question and a comment. So my question is like, what does that mean that there are different profiles of ungrammatical sentences? And secondly, it's interesting to me, right, that none of the healthy subjects seem to produce agrammatic style errors or linearization errors in your scheme. And why is that the case, right? It makes a lot of sense in terms of our previous experience, right? We had a lot of difficulty coding paragrammatic errors and distinguishing those from non-paragrammatic errors in the past, which it makes sense if it's the case that healthy people produce paragrammatic errors all the time, right? Then it makes sense that it's hard to distinguish healthy from paragrammatic if healthy includes paragrammatic in some sense. But why is that the case? Why don't healthy people produce agrammatic errors? And then what's going on with these different profiles of ungrammatical errors in healthy subjects?
So I think one of the things that you and I have discussed in the past is that at least some part of paragrammatism might just be a failure of monitoring. And so it could be that when we see these paragrammatic errors arising in healthy participants, some of them are the result of you generated a bad structure and then you just didn't catch it in the output. And some of them might be that there's always some underlying level of noise that is being created when we're producing language. And then some people are better at regulating that noise and then catching errors versus not. So like if we're looking at the, hold on, let me see if I can pull up my little map here.
So, while you're doing that, it's just why, so that implies that the agrammatic or linearization errors are not the result of noise, doesn't it?
Yeah, that would.
Which is interesting. I mean, I just don't know if I understand that, right? Or why that's the case.
So like the linearization errors are not the result of noise because they're a result of like a breakdown in the computational process. So rather than, so like my distinction between noise and not noise is if it's noise, you have the ability to generate the right thing and something got interrupted. And so when you tried to do that, it got a little fuzzy versus the linearization ones where the fuzziness is not the issue. You just can't generate the right thing. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to call time, Jeremy. I think we can continue this discussion offline, but please, everyone, thank Jeremy again for their presentation.